Okay, welcome everyone. I have a short introduction just while everyone virtually files in. A few housekeeping details. Thank you so much for virtually attending tonight. I'm Gracie. I'm the events coordinator for print. Those housekeeping details before we get started. If you have any questions during the discussion, please feel free to enter them in the chat box or in the question and answer function, which is on the bottom bar of your screen. If you'd like a copy of tonight's book, I'll include the link to the print page in the chat box so you can click right on through. And now for tonight's speakers. Erica Rand lives in Portland and teaches at Bates College in the program in Gender and Sexuality Studies in the Department of Art and Visual Culture. She serves on the editorial board of the journal Radical Teacher and is also the author of Barbie's Queer Accessories, The Ellis Island Snow Globe, and Red Nails, Black Skates, Gender, Cash, and Pleasure on and Off the Ice. Cole Rizki teaches in Latin American and Trans Studies at the University of Virginia. He's the co-editor of Trans Studies in Las Americas, a special issue of Transgender Studies Quarterly on Latin American, Caribbean, and Latinx trans studies, and the translation section editor of TSQ. His work appears in journals such as TSQ, GLQ, Journal of Visual Culture, and Radical History Review. So please join me in virtually welcoming Erica and Cole.
Thank you, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you, Erica, for having this conversation. I just want to start with some brief remarks, and then I have some questions for you. The small book of hip checks on queer gender, race, and writing is the latest of Erica Rand's 4 monographs. Hip checks is comprised of a series of 14 vignettes that address, in Erica's words, quote, the entangled workings of pleasure, regulation, policing, and survival. By deploying the hip check as a critical device, she knocks us and herself out of well-worn writing, perceptual, and critical habits, tuning us in anew to the relationships between queer gender, race, and writing. In hip checks and throughout her work, Erica does theory through the vernacular, through the everyday scene. As readers, we're by her side, we see through her eyes. In hip checks, we can all relate to the short vignettes she shares, and yet Erica manages to make the familiar unfamiliar, to fissure and rend open what we might not have otherwise seen. We see and feel with her. She invites us into her thinking and rethinking, her writing and rewriting. The hip check may be one that throws us off balance, but Erica doesn't slam us into the boards or leave us face down on the ice. Rather, Erica's writing, and this I think is a function of her critical generosity, reaches out for and steadies us, even as it redirects our motion, our desires, and our critical attention. The hip check is not a diagnostic or a corrective. Instead, it's an invitation to see, feel, and think otherwise about the world we inhabit in all of its complexities and textures. Erica's prose is a complicit smile. Her writerly voice is one to which I aspire. And this book, also on writerly experimentation, is a true pleasure to read. With that, I want to welcome Erica Rand and begin our conversation with a question about how you came to the project.
Thank you, and thank you so much for this generous introduction. Super exciting, and I just want to say that Cole and I met when he presented at our Emerging Scholars Conference at Bates, and for the past, ever since then, we've had this really amazing writing exchange, and I'm super grateful that he's here to talk to me about the book. So I'll say that the way this book got started, when I finished my last book, Red Nails, Black Skates, which is an autoethnography of figure skating, I was still really stuck on hips, stuck on in the sense of the old-fashioned sense of sort of hooked on or crushed out on, and also in the sense of just stuck, mired. I really want to keep going. So when TSQ, the Transgender Studies Quarterly, had a call for keywords for their new journal, I decided I wanted to try to write something on hips, which I had never, which was not on their list of suggested topics. So I turned in this pretty weird, somewhat poetic meditation on hips instead of a traditional keyword discussion. And eventually they accepted it with the saying that, or with the comment that they had been told by the readers who read it that it was so different than everything else that either they had to take it or they had to reject it. And the fact that they took it was a very big was just really heartening and stayed with me, and I just wanted to keep going. The second thing that kind of led me to the book was that in around the same year, 2012, 2013, Lauren Berlant at University of Chicago invited me to present something in a series on queer experimental writing. And I have to say that that invitation was itself a hip check, because I hadn't really thought of myself as somebody who did experimental writing. And just even thinking of myself that way changed the way I looked at things. So for that, I started to have this idea that I was going to tell this story and then like retell it in a different way. And the story I thought it was a story about a fluffy yellow dress that I had to do with kindergarten and mourning and death and all kinds of transformations. And then gradually I figured out that it was really a story about something that kind of had the same amount of fluff to it, which was this fancy pink box. Anyway, in the process of doing all of that, I started really thinking about the sort of act of experimentation and how hard it was for me to actually do. So I worked on this project of coming up with the idea of trying to turn experimentation into muscle memory.
Thank you. You said that the invitation hip checked you from Lauren Berlant. Can you tell us about the hip check? What does it mean? And what does it do for you and for your readers, a critical device?
Sure. So first of all, like I didn't even think till much after that. I sort of picked a sports metaphor, not in a sport that I actually do. And my attempt to do that sport did not work that well because I would much rather be twirling around on a kick line or something. But in any case, I think of the hip check in several different ways. One, in a less traditional way of putting the two words together to think of hip inspection. And I think of that partly because of the ways that race and gender and sexuality are so entangled in the way people look at themselves and other people and sort of gatekeep around hips and express themselves around hips. And the other way is in terms of the traditional sports meaning that comes in a lot of different sports, hockey, basketball, many others. So I'm just going to read you a very short paragraph about how I think of the hip check, which is basically about the idea of getting people to change directions or sort of pushing people to change directions a little. Being hip checked knocks you off balance. If you're moving, it knocks you off course, rerouting you, as the NBA handbook puts it. Where the hip check grates against my intention is that I'm not after the reader as an adversary or competitor. Far from it. I write with a vision of collaborative thinking and strive to approach my engagement with others in life and writing from generosity of spirit. Thus, my excitement, for example, and I'll get to this example later, of in found commonalities with Annette's mother, Leola, my attention to how people might get things right, even while it seems like they're always getting things wrong, and my desire to look from different perspectives, to avoid common critical moves that trounce or diminish others, and to view self-satisfaction or imagined superiority as an occasion to rethink where I am rather than to rest. So that's all true, but it's also misleading, at least to the extent that it conjures gentle, rosy sweetness evacuated of power. When I read it back, it sounds like relationships where no one ever gets pissy or sex where no one's ever on top. That's not me, and it's not this book, which is why I like the hip check. My aim here is both to disrupt your path of thinking, feeling, and movement, and to advocate for openness to what being hip checked might deliver. Despite or because sometimes of being painful, because of or despite sometimes being pleasurable.
Thanks, Erica. That's really helpful. At one point, yeah, you mentioned, I think it's on page 11, that, sorry, flipping here in my copy, that you're interested in the pleasure regulation, the entangled workings of pleasure, regulation, policing, and survival. I think this comes out nicely in your move to reinterpreting, rethinking, recounting, and returning, as you've just mentioned, is central to your writing practice. Can you say a little bit more about what you revisit in the book and why you've chosen these particular scenes? Take us to an example and show us the box.
Okay, so I've been working for a lot of years in a bunch of different fields, like differently than what some academics do. So some of the writing I've revisited comes from queer and trans sport studies, from migration studies, from personal life. Something actually comes from high school. Something comes from stories I heard about how people got outed as queer in Lewiston, Maine, where I teach. A lot of other things. And I'm going to give you this one example, which is the example that I start with in the book. And I'm going to read to you maybe for 10 minutes, just to give you an example of one of the stories that I tell. And this is called, I call it a story where an origin story might go. In the early 1990s, I received a garish pink box from a woman I came to love as she came to love me, despite expectations that we wouldn't have anything to talk about. Her name was Leola, and we met because I was dating her daughter, Annette. Annette and I came to love each other too, but when we met, we were hardly aiming for in-laws. Both recuperating from big stories, as my friend Pocky would put it, we didn't yet have energy for new ones. We did, however, have nicely compatible erotic tastes and a big interest in regularly available sex. We also liked each other a lot, and I think some emotional comfort associated with having someone in the land of crummy 2x2 norms. A logical recipient of news, a person who these days would be logical to text, a date on occasion when heart or custom called for it in a way we wanted to answer. Thus, that Thanksgiving, we stopped by Leola's on the way to holiday dinner at the home of Annette's childhood friend, Joanne, in Bangor, Maine, where Annette had grown up. Leola still lived there with her second husband, John. She left her first husband, Annette's father, after accumulating the wherewithal to support herself by selling homemade crafts at flea markets. As Annette told it, her mother spent every spare minute hidden away in a closet-like workspace, sewing 1,000 scrunchies or making other objects like Christmas ornaments with knit balls forming the bodies of cute animals that Annette had shown me before hiding them away. I remember wondering aloud before the trip if Leola might give me something like that. Annette laughed. Of course not. Why would a woman who had raised 6 kids, whose school bus had been a hay wagon, what would she even have to say to a city girl dyke professor? As a Jew too, I was frequently taken as an outsider in Maine. Foreign, exotic, maybe not white. Still, I wasn't so sure about Annette's prediction. Strangers tell me things all the time. But when we sat down to a full dinner at 10:30 a.m., which was Leola's response to learning we were going somewhere else for Thanksgiving, and I saw a hunting rifle casually propped next to the dinner table, I did think I had entered foreign territory. As it turned out, however, Leola had a lot to tell me, particularly about Annette being queer. She'd known Annette was different, as she put it, since the age of 4, when Annette started refusing to wear dresses. Annette listened in shock. The information about her early gender presentation, though new, didn't surprise her. Annette saw herself as butch from birth, but her mother had never mentioned any such thing. Why would she be telling me? Annette was even more astonished when she returned from the car, having gone to fetch some issues of Our Paper, a queer newspaper Annette thought her mother might newly be interested in, and saw me holding the pink box. Through the clear plastic bag that kept the dust off between flea markets, you could see the box in all its glory, bearing seemingly every mark of feminine fanciness that a glue gun might apply. Folds of shiny pink material, which had a watercolor or tie-dye effect more visible on the inside, and on top, lace, ruffles, ribbons, beads, and a glorious plastic flower. open, deep, and equipped for attraction. And I'm just going to stop here because it's Zoom and I can show you the box, which I'm super excited to do. I still have it. So here it is with the fabulous top. Opens up for even, it's a little faded now, but it's just incredible. That's also kind of my Vanna White moment. It's hard to describe this box without sounding like I'm making fun of it. I'm not, though I distinctly remember trying not to laugh as I showed it to Annette. The morning had been so unpredictable, the box seemed at first a little hilariously over the top. Yet I loved it from no lofty distance, and I knew that it was as extravagant a gesture as in embellishment. Leola had bought her independence dime by dime and still lived modestly. Parting with a labor-intensive item she'd made to sell was a big deal. It was a gift as substantial as our conversations, of which there were more to come, often on subsequent visits when she could get me alone. Why did Leola have so much to discuss with me? Maybe I showed up at just the right moment when Leola finally wanted to acknowledge her queer butch daughter out loud. Maybe telling me the old family stories, the new old family stories, constituted a gesture of accepting me as a daughter-in-law. Leola, I think, mistook me for the equivalent of Annette's wife, and why wouldn't she? Annette, who hardly saw or spoke to her mother, had brought me home for the holidays. After this first success, Annette always brought me along. Leola never saw her without me. Besides, Annette and I had the butch femme thing going, which can offer the comforting familiarity of at least to people who don't want to kill you after it signals to them that you're queer. Perceptions of commonality can enhance interactions even when those perceptions are inaccurate. And really, when are perceptions of other people's genders or relationships, or even our own, exactly right? For instance, I saw Annette and her friend Joanne as two old-style white butches dressed to hide the feminine curves that their dates had on display, and in stylish contradiction to those no-nonsense straight white women who can confuse newcomers in states like Maine or Wisconsin, even newcomers like me with seriously refined butchdar. Over Thanksgiving dinner, however, Annette and Joanne talked about how happy they were to have traditional butch femme roles behind them. Yet despite laughing off those roles, Annette considered some butch femme divisions of labor non-negotiable and had already developed tricks to scam me, fearing incorrectly those preconceptions again, that they might offend my feminist tendencies. I'll drive us to Bangor, she said, since you drove to my place. She really meant the butch always drives. She fooled me on the driving for years until she had a bout of sciatica that required me to drive. Annette wanted to duck rather than be seen as the passenger. Leola and I had girl talk. Woman to woman, woman to femme, mother to daughter-in-law. It was all of those simultaneously, none of those exactly, and more than any of those too. Fundamentally, we really liked each other. Besides, despite our differences, we had a lot in common, including one thing that brought me and Annette together, a big interest in sex. Annette's father told me during our very brief one-time encounter that Leola had left him because he couldn't satisfy her sexually. I don't know if that was true, but I quite loved the idea. I'd come a bit late myself to the notion that it was okay for sex to matter enough into staying or going. But even setting aside his unsolicited opinion, Leola's interest was evident and hardly only heteromarital. Once she told us about how she and John had accidentally parked their RV for the night right next to a cruising spot in the woods for gay men. What did you do? I asked, expecting some account of disgust or disapproval, given how shocked she sounded. Not at all. We stayed up all night and watched, she said excitedly. Like daughter, like mother, on more levels than I would share with her or that I will share with you. So maybe I'll just say quickly that that story means several different things to me. And first, it has been one of my favorite stories for just some reasons that are encoded in there, like the way people make connections across disparate things, and queer and straight things don't always work together, and we shouldn't take things for granted. And I love the sex and gender in there. And, you know, then as I started rethinking the story, I thought more about how I had never really paid attention to the way it was also a story possibly about gender coercion. And I'd never, for instance, asked whether, um, you know, I never asked about people's gender presentations, but I never thought through so much about it. And I started to think of it differently as also an occasion of my own privilege and awful willful, like not understanding things. So it's from that basis that I moved into the basic story of what the book's about.
Thanks, Erica. I think that some of that story too, I'm just going to quote you again from page 7 here. Significantly too, in this story, respectful engagement, collaborative learning, and good connections do not always depend on getting things right. And getting things right can occur despite misrecognition and along indirect paths. I think that's what the book brings that's particularly exciting and special to your writing. Let's go to clocking the unnatural. I want to talk about the lavender dildos. It's on page 85.
Thank you for asking that. I prompted that question because this is an example of getting hip checked by, you just told me the page and now I forgot what the page is. 85. Okay, so this piece came from actually being hip checked by some research that my research assistant at the time did, Gigi Glasson, who's here. So grateful to, I'm going to show you a picture of a text exchange. You have to read the text exchange, but I just want to show it to you. And what happened is that I'd had this idea to think about, I've been listening to all these people like older, even not so old dykes, but other queer women and queer non-binary people, all sorts of people saying sex has changed these days. It's really different these days. And many people thought it had something to do with being sort of more cock-centered these days than back in the old days. So I got Grace, who also I want to say had already graduated, because I don't know if I would have asked an undergraduate to go read porn magazines, but Grace, a former student, research assistant, went to the Brown Archive to look at many issues of On Our Backs from the 90s, which is what I associated with the old days I thought people were talking about. And one of the things they came up with was was this surprise of saying, well, as the text exchange says, lots of exciting stuff to sift through. I will say, apparently, 90s dykes who are into dildos are into lavender dildos. Who knew? Well, at least I didn't know. And I wrote back, well, I knew. But anyway, that sent me sort of to thinking about kind of what changed so that a person who at the time was, let's say, 25 would be surprised by something that I wasn't surprised by. So it shifted my whole topic to this artifact. And I discovered some shifting in how, like, by now, in some cases, lavender is super mainstream. And I think, and various other things about how race and other issues were involved, both in earlier years and later.
Great. I think that ties nicely, your last comment in particular, to the subtitle of the book, which is Queer Gender, Race, and Writing. I'm going to quote you again on page 89, just to follow up on your comment about the lavender dildo, which is avoiding an approximation of your skin tone might have different implications if your skin makes you a target rather than an agent of racism. It's really interesting how you read the dildo as potentially having a feminist pedigree, yet juxtaposed with this idea of racial non-content. I think it really illustrates how the book pushes us to consider multiple meanings of cultural artifacts and stories that you share. Can you tell us a little bit more about the intersections of queer gender, race, and writing?
Yes, and I want to give this one example, which is thinking, so this is one thing that happens a lot in this book is I talk about writing decisions that I make. Because I think one of the things that often bugs me about writing is that once you get, and I'm always the one who's trying to make it look seamless, but then the hard decisions you make aren't in there. So I wanted to talk about some of those decisions. And just to give one example, there's a section on the figure skater Debi Thomas and the tennis star Serena Williams, more famous today, who both got censured in different ways for wearing what in Thomas's case was called a unitard, and in Williams' case, a catsuit. It made me think a lot about how the language I try to use to denaturalize the gender binary in sport does not work for everybody. And I was going to read something from it, but I think I'm just going to skim for myself and give you the basic idea, which is, I'll just read a little bit. I sometimes use the term female gendered, like terms like female labeled categories or people skating as male, instead of shorter official designations used in gender designated sports. I do so to denaturalize the use of binary gender categories, which are presented as obvious and adequate sorting devices in sports, but actually do not really work. Because lots of people don't fit into them, and also because gender categories do not actually in any way get you to a level playing field. There are so many other factors that people don't even think about. So I was really satisfied with this textual strategy to denaturalize sport categories. And then you run into this huge problem because of race. And the reason is because where fair play is involved, suspicion usually falls on women, and actually primarily falls, like the question of, are people female enough to be competing as women, and especially falls on BIPOC women, especially Black women. So, and one of the things, there's been some amazing work by Katrina Cassis and Rebecca M. Jordan Young talking about, for instance, building on the work of post-colonial scholars. And one of the things they talk about is the way all this talk in the Olympics and other things about like, do people qualify as women, are all directed to Black and brown women for the global South. And if you pay attention to work on Serena Williams, you'll know that people are always questioning, like, is she really female? Like hostile racist crap is about, is she really female? So when you say, so if I were to say Serena Williams competing in the category of women's tennis, I'm actually, very problematically appearing possibly to support that work. So those are some of the issues that I try to think about through the book in terms of how intersections of race and queer gender are one of the issues that factor into writing.
And here you share that that's how you're, in seeking to deliver a hip check, you're writing hip check to you in the execution. Which is part of what Kay Ringelberg draws our attention to here. They share one of my fave things about the book, the interplay of your own writing thinking and the subjects objects you explore. It's rich and makes me feel like the book almost can't be excerpted. Just to share chat comments.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Can you also, in your conclusion, you mentioned a talk that Lisa Bunker gave at Printed at this very bookstore on post-binary ideas about writing that ties in nicely to what you've just said about the way in which your language or the ways in which you've delivered hip checks, in fact, hip checks you. Can you say more about how Bunker's critical practice informs your own writing and what kind of models and critical generosity you're exploring?
Yes, so just to emphasize, one reason I was super happy to do this at Print was because I had this really transformative experience coming to a presentation by Lisa Bunker, who had just published this amazing middle grade book called Zenobia July, a novel about a trans girl cyber detective at a new middle school. It takes place in Portland. Okay, that's my ad for that. Anyway, so she talks about 6 principles of non-binary writing, and besides, to just quote myself here, besides refusing given ideas of normal, one effect being that the cis rather than trans or non-binary characters, she says, flutter around the edges of her novels. The principles include not creating characters who are absolute villains, principles of avoiding snark, and practicing love, practicing as in working at it. So the way she linked up enemy formation with dichotomous thinking of gender binaries sent me back to do something I had been really working on throughout the book, which was to see what would happen if I applied generosity of spirit in the way I wanted to, both in critical thinking and writing, and then in some revisitations. And I just want to say, like, I kept thinking, what could I read from about figure skating for people here? And I don't have something, but I want to say I do have a section on the famous Dorothy Hamill haircut from the 70s, and thinking about someone today whose hair reminded me of it, and then thinking, I could think something about that, but like, what if I thought about it in sort of broad, different kind of ways?
Thanks, Erica. I want to remind everyone to please put questions in the chat as we go. We're right around 7:30, so I want to invite you to add questions to the chat.
Or the Q&A.
Sorry, the Q&A. There we
function.
go. Yes, Q&A function. There we go. And we can keep. I think that some of that idea of generosity of critical habits comes in the relationship between the comment that you got about finding another sway where the hip check could be read potentially as a corrective. Can you say a little bit more about the relationship between can you find another sway and maybe how you've sort of reshaped your critical practice based on some of the feedback that you got?
Yeah, so one of the things, I talk in a lot of places in the book about things that have checked me, and just to say a few other of them too, like one thing that happened that was sort of super amazing, bad, but good, was getting sort of hip checked my own body. So my understanding of my own body supporting my femme gender identity like went out the window when menopause said, oh, let's reshape all your fat. But the thing you're talking about is I showed some early writing to a friend who said, who wrote back that he wasn't totally thrilled about my habit of like telling a story one way and then another way, which I actually do in the introduction to the book, which is like I say something and I think, oh, there's all this pleasure here. And then I go, wait, but, here's a problem. And so my friend said, can you, this is not, this is great, but it actually is stopping your hips in a way, like symbolically put it, stopping your hips. Can you find another sway, which was S in parentheses and then way. So find another way, but hips. And then it really sent me to try to rethink. And when I went and looked back at the manuscript, I saw all these different places where I was doing exactly that. Oh, here's some pleasure, but wait, it's terrible. And so it induced me to change some forms of what I was doing in different places. And at the end of sections, including, I won't really talk much about it, but one at the end of one section where I had ended something with like kind of yet another story about how white people appropriate the movement of BIPOC people, and just thought, what if I don't do that and just stop on the actual movements I was talking about?
Thanks, Erica. I see we have some questions in the Q&A, so I just want to throw these out to you.
Fantastic.
Kira Towns, how do you bring this notion of hip checking into your teaching pedagogy in addition to your writing?
Aha, and this comes from somebody who has been in my classroom. So that's a great question, and I've had to think about it a lot, because one of the things I realized is that even while I was trying to change my own writing habits and discovering that the typical writing strategy of having people have a topic, roadmap, and thesis statement and write a traditional paper. Like I was still asking people to do that. And so now one thing I work to do is like sort of, first of all, emphasize curiosity and to give students opportunity to think beyond models that they've been traditionally taught. So to try to reframe what they've been doing by really thinking about how do they want to write what they want to write. And also by some curriculum where I throw together a bunch of stuff that does not seem to match.
Lisa Bunker also has a question. Thank you for the mention. Do you have any thoughts to share on the current conservative push to exclude trans women from women's sports?
Yes, it's terrible. I mean, that's not the only thing to say, but, you know, first of all, it just seems to me like something people are taking. So first of all, I guess one thing I want to say is there's a huge amount of evidence that, first of all, sports should be inclusive, and there's huge amounts of evidence that having people, because especially they're trying to stop people from competing in high school, there's huge amounts of evidence that it's not, one, we don't know, for instance, what testosterone actually does as a sports thing, advantage or not, that it seems to me that it's just a right-wing, huge strategy to scare tactics, right? It's the same thing that happened X number of years ago where there were all these bathroom bills and putting up this specter that there would be men in the women's bathroom or something like that. So it just seems like something, there are bills in more than 20 states and they're passing in one state and another. So it seems like something we really have to be on the lookout for, including in Maine where things are happening. So I would encourage everybody to find out what's happening in your state and, you know, really learn some things about how completely false this alarm is. And yeah.
I also have a question from Sam Stiegler, which I actually share this question, so I'm very curious to hear your thoughts here, Erica. I share these other questions as well, but in particular. Thanks, Erica and Cole. One of my favorite things about the book is that the writing is equal parts playful, tender, and serious. Any advice for how to achieve that balance? Are there any origin stories as to how your writing came to be this way? Maybe this ties in nicely to your series as well, if you'd like to talk about it.
Yes. So so I can tell you some, like, I'll just tell you one sort of thing that happened when I was working on my second book, which was, so first of all, I guess I want to say that like writing rules are embedded in power. And so it's not that surprising that my opportunities and headspace to do experimental work and to put some things about myself out there that I wouldn't necessarily put out otherwise were helped along with tenure. And I'll also say that it involved a certain bit of bravery, because I will just say that based on some personal stuff I've written and some of the more playful stuff and other things I've written, they're not always recognized as serious theory. They're sometimes described as like masturbatory crap and a bunch of other stuff. So partly I will say thick skin, but I'll also say that one of the specific writing things that happened to me was when I was working on the Ellis Island snow globe. Every time I started to write like an introductory narrative or something, that grew and grew and grew and grew. So I had this mental note in my head, this can be 3 pages. And then I have to get to the paragraph that goes, this chapter does blah, blah, blah. And I could not get to that paragraph. And I think some of that just contributed to trying to find other things to do and seeing if I could let myself go there. I'm not sure that's totally an answer, but I do at the end of the book give this little example for like how to hip check your writing. And it's partly just saying like, hey, what's working or what's not working and how might I really think differently? and to talk about the series. So this is the second book in a series called Writing Matters, that Writing Matters with an exclamation point, which we partly put in because the publicity department thought Writing Matters was not jazzy enough or something. But anyway, it's a series for experimental writing. And I encourage everyone to take a look at it. Thank you for typing in. If you look for my book on the Duke Press site, you can click on Writing Matters and see what it's about. And it's really about trying to think in different kinds of ways and use writing as sort of part of the work of experimentation, not just the idea of experimentation looking one way or another, but, you know, as part of writing practice. And I think it's just has made a huge difference to me, as I said at the very beginning, to have people say, hey, experimental writing is great, keep going. So I would also encourage everybody to say, keep going to other people who are writing with you.
How does this, given this book is part of this series and you are particularly experimental here with the tone and the affect and the form of the book, did this differ from, in terms of your experience of writing, did this differ from your other books? If so, how? Tell us a little more about the process of writing this particular book.
Okay, so this book, first of all, I'll just tell you, this book took longer than any other book I've written. I started in 2012, it's now 2021, just came out. It was a little, there was some similarity in a way to the skating book, which came before it, in that I really, like part of my process is to focus on something and then go back over it and go back over it and go back over it and go back over it. And sometimes in the process of writing, I learn other things. So there's actually a, one of the pieces in it is called Queer Indirections, is actually about the process of doing the kind of writing and thinking that turned into the book, which was I had these stories that I used to tell all the time, might still keep telling, about like indirect queer thinking, about something which partly I thought I was really good at, of like sensing things that weren't exactly there. And then as I kept telling the stories, and then as I started to write those stories down, you know, the stories were moving. And so they weren't really what I thought. And one of the things I say in the book is that like objects of contemplation do not stand still, even if contemplation suggests being quiet and still. So, and I'll just I want to give one example of a story because it takes place in Lewiston, Maine, where I teach, and we're in Maine, and a lot of the books about Maine. And this happened in 1990 when I started teaching at Bates, and I had a new colleague who told me this story about how, so he was middle-aged, he described himself middle-aged guy, but he was 40. So now I think, okay, I'm in my 60s. I'm like, what does that mean? But anyway, made sense at the time. He came out as gay, he was married, he had 2 kids, and he, you know, got divorced, was living on his own. And he said to his kids who were in high school, he didn't, you know, he'd already put them through so much that he wasn't going to do anything like being out in an extravagant way. And they could tell their friends if they wanted to, but he wasn't going to push it. So when his son told the son's girlfriend, the girlfriend said, everybody in, you know, Edward Little High School knows your dad's gay. And why did they know? They knew for 2 reasons. One of his classmates had seen him buying whole bean Dunkin' Donuts coffee at 10 o'clock at night. And they figured, 1, well, who else but gay men would be buying whole bean coffee? But 2, most people, most of their parents, when they got divorced, the dad got a younger wife. And if there had been a younger wife, she would have been buying the food. So at first I just thought like, okay, that's unsophisticated thinking. And I just come from Chicago and Dunkin' Donuts coffee, whatever, right? And then the more I thought about it, I thought, you know, that's really snotty of me because first of all, that kid was right, you know, and I wish I had marked the page because I would want to read you this paragraph, but I think I could quickly find, well, the point is basically that, you know, if you think about it in the particular relationship of capitalism and cachet in the early 90s, you know, the kid was onto something. And maybe, you know, he was queer himself and had to learn the signals. And there were so many ways to think generously about that story rather than, you know, here's a kid who, you know, is living in this strange town I just moved to.
That's great. There are two questions that I'd like to stack, if that's okay with you,
Yeah.
Erica. One comes from,
Exactly.
one comes from Stephanie Wade. Would you say more about experimental writing and social justice? The second question, Danny Carmona, hip checking to me feels like a heavily vulnerable practice. And so I'm curious on your thoughts on negotiating the relationship with vulnerability in writing, specifically when writing about one's life and the lives of others and all the messiness entwined with the entire process. Also, hi, Erica, love the book XOXO.
Okay, so I got onto, oh yeah, right. So, okay, to say things about both of those things. So first I want to say experimental writing and social justice, there's so much to say about that. And Stephanie, I know, has a lot to say. Also, that's super smart, who I've just really learned from a lot. But one of the things is that like forms of writing are really laden with white supremacist classist values. So thinking about different ways to write are also ways to kind of free up your writing in a sense from some of those values. But it's also important to think in terms of getting to vulnerability in a second. I think it's also important to think about like what it is people need in terms of their lives and credentials. So how do people find their voices, our voices, and also how do people learn to navigate the, you know, worlds they want to navigate with their writing. So I think it's super complex. And Danny, to get to the vulnerability issue. So one thing I want to say about process is that story about Annette that I told at the beginning. I want to say one thing about process was I ran that story by her. Like I said, I want to show you this story. I want to know if it's okay with you. And I want to know if you want me to use your name, if I can use your name, right? So she read several drafts of it, and it was so interesting to find out, and this is just a methodology question, if you ever do ethnography, autoethnography, it was interesting to find out the stuff I did that bugged her. And just to give you one example that I never would have thought of, when I first wrote about those objects that she got from her mother, and I didn't, she was afraid people would think she was still was displaying them in her apartment, and like, you know, a butch would never put that frilly stuff in the apartment. So I never would have known that that would be a huge bad point if I hadn't shared it with her. So part of my writing and research practice is always when I'm talking about people in depth to talk to them about the writing itself. In other books, I sometimes use that, but also the tradition of pretending it happened in a different place. In other words, and you know, fictionalizing some of the thing. But I also want to say that there is so much vulnerability in, not like I want a big reward for vulnerability, but there well, I just actually want to say one thing is that at the end of the introduction, I have this section called edits out, entered in. And I talk about some things I took out of the book. And some of them are about like colloquial language that I was afraid people would read wrong, or, I wanted to save till people liked me better in the middle of the book. But one of them was a narrative about somebody who had gotten like basically gay and trans bashed, in a way very related to self-presentation and hips and self-styling and self-fashioning and hips. And it was really like illustrated exactly this idea that, hips can be a huge source of pleasure and also danger. And they were actually interested in having me talk about it as part of sort of spreading the word about what was happening. But as I went on, I felt like there was no way I wanted to present something violent in that particular way. And I also knew that things look different on the page than when you imagine it. And there have been things that I have written that I thought, like, I've written them 100 times and I don't feel, I feel like I used to feel vulnerable about that and now I don't. But then when I read it on a page, and I've written it myself, that vulnerability and, very complicated feelings come out.
Thanks for that really thoughtful and beautiful response. I have more questions. One's from Geeta Patel and one is from Lauren Berlant. The first from Geeta Patel. Does your prose, topics, objects of contemplation, the protagonist in your story, fables, wander in ways you don't expect as you write? That is, does your writing hip check you as a writer, lead you askance to unexpected places? I compose and I find myself wandering unexpectedly. The Urdu word is awaragi. Fiction writers and musicians speak about this, a form of vulnerability to one's own prose. That's question. Would you like to answer that first?
I almost have just a one-word answer, which is yes. Like, so much of this book changed in the process of writing about it. Like, just, I follow something and it's different, and also sometimes I find it and it leads to sort of nowhere. And one of the things about like starting out with this, like, I had this yellow dress in mind. It was also a story about, it was also an object with feminine frills, and it had a bunch of things going on, and it led to nothing except more about me. And I was saying to someone, oh, but it's kind of like, and then I couldn't find it. So I picked up this box as something that had some of the frills. I'm like, it's the box. So the answer is kind of yes. Yeah.
Great. Lauren Berlant asks, writes, it can also serve mystification, especially when you have a stake in not learning something. She's quoting you there. I'd love for you to riff on what the implications of practicing not learning are, especially since you're also offering the beauty of finding your own queer gender. I think it's different than having a stake in unlearning something.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, wow. I mean, there's so much about, and I talk in a lot of different places actually in the book about like stakes and not knowing things, and including one of the things I say at the beginning is I quote somebody very close to me who said, like, why are you, when I thought I was writing a whole book about hips, like, why are you writing a book about the meanest topic to ask trans people about? And the other thing that quote Lauren is talking about comes from is having had a big stake in sort of enjoying some natural idea of my own queer gender as somehow in my body. Like, I have a femme body, so I have a femme gender, even though I knew it was crap, or could easily see it was crap. So I don't know what I have to say about that exactly, except that I think about that and struggle with that a lot and try to see, like, what happens both in like sort of looking back at where I was and then where I might go. And I'm finding things like that all the time. I saw a skating question somewhere in there.
Yes.
I saw somebody go by who said, like, I have a skating question.
I found it, I think it is from Anna Keller. I'll throw out a figure skating related one. At the World Championships last week, Yuzuru Hanyu, two-time Olympic champion, asked about the differences between men's versus ladies and said that figure skating isn't about gender, it's about individuality and character. Yuma Kageyama and Nathan Chen, the other medalists, agreed. Nate also added that, quote, there's nothing the men can do that ladies can as well. Care to comment? My first thought was that, of course, it's about gender. That's one figure skating question. And I will just give you one more question as well. Monica Huerta says, hi, so good to see you both. I wonder if I can ask Erica to think about the relationship between the ways you've been talking about vulnerability and the commitment to an aesthetics of generosity, vulnerability, commitment to aesthetics of generosity, and the skating question.
Okay, it would be a very interesting thing to try to put them together. I think some of the connection between generosity and vulnerability has something to, I mean, there's so much to say about that. Like people, I'm so excited to have learned that like the chat and questions will be available for me afterwards because I'm learning so much from them. But I think, I think generosity to like what we think, what other people think, what might be going on, what happens when you look at things and people and scenes and Monica Huerta has an amazing book coming out in the series called Magical Habits that really, I admire so much, and I think it's coming out in August, for just being open to expressing not only to just trying things out and presenting different kinds of writing too. That wasn't very eloquent, but I partly recommend going to that book in August and getting an amazing example of how that works. And I think the question of how, and I just want to say that Anna and I are pairs partners, and it's been sort of amazing to think sort of beyond the skating binary, and we've run into all the time. And I think the way things are about gender, like we sort of illustrate in that we have gender identities that don't fit into a typical pairs thing. And yet because of some physical body differences like height, we are always finding how gender is really embedded in every aspect of skating that we try, like how much the tricks are embedded with sort of embodied traditions of gender. So there's so much to say about that, but I just think, there's a ton of ways. And also to me, one of the things I say in the book is that one thing I love about skating rinks is the opportunity to spectate consensual gender and just places where people may really be grooving on their gender in some way or another is just a huge pleasure. And I always like to keep pleasure in the mix when we're also talking about hard stuff.
So sorry to pop back on and interrupt. Cole, do you have one more?
Oh, I just wanted to say that I've dropped Monica Huerta's Magical Habits into the chat. You can find the link there if you want to check out her book.
Fantastic. And I have taken down all the questions. So if Erica has time, I can always send those over and get those answers to you. Thank you both so much for such a fantastic conversation. And thank you everyone for attending. I posted the link over to print. It's right also on our events page for a copy of tonight's book. And I think that's all for me. Thank you both so much.
Thank you. I also want to say, Erica, this is your first event celebrating your book launch, right? Is that true?
Oh, yes.
Or one of the first?
Welcome to my book launch. Yes.
Yeah,
and
everyone,
thank you so
please,
much to print. Yeah.
Yeah, please congratulate Erica in the chat if you can before we sign off for this big deal in the times of COVID. Big congratulations to you, Erica. This was awesome. Thank you so much for the invitation to be in conversation with you, and thanks to Print for hosting us.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you to everyone and have a great night.